She didn't even raise her voice. She simply looked at me and said, "I don't owe you fidelity." At that moment, something inside me snapped. Not because of the betrayal, because of the way she said it. Calmly, confidently, without a trace of shame. I stood in the kitchen of our house, phone in hand, filled with messages that couldn't be explained as friendship. I expected something. Panic, excuses, tears. Instead, coldness. "Are you serious?" I asked, feeling my voice betray me. She shrugged. "Yes, you act like I owe you something." I didn't realize it right away, but that was when our marriage died. Not when she slept with someone else, but when she decided that fidelity was a fantasy of mine, not the foundation of what we had built. She didn't deny the betrayal. She didn't apologize. She was explaining to me why she didn't feel guilty. "You're being overly dramatic," she added, turning away as if the conversation was already over. I stood there, humiliated not by the fact of the betrayal, but by the fact that the man I'd spent years with was looking at me as if I'd dared to demand more than I could handle. In that second, it dawned on me. I wasn't talking to my wife. I was talking to someone who couldn't care less. Before everything shifted, our marriage looked solid from the outside. Not perfect, but stable enough that I never questioned its foundation. We had routines. Coffee together in the mornings. Texts during the day about nothing important. Dinners where we talked about work, plans, normal life. I believed we were a team. She used to say things like, "We're good," and I took that at face value. We didn't fight much, which I mistook for harmony instead of avoidance. I thought loyalty was implied, not something that needed to be negotiated or defined. I never imagined I'd have to defend the idea of being faithful to your spouse. Looking back, the marriage wasn't falling apart. It was quietly hollowing out. Affection became efficient. Conversations became practical. We functioned well, but we didn't connect deeply anymore. I told myself that's just what long-term relationships look like. Comfort over passion. Stability over intensity. What I didn't see then was that while I was investing in us, she had already started detaching. The marriage didn't end suddenly. It shifted slowly, silently, and I was the last one to notice. The changes were small enough to dismiss, which is exactly what I did. She started guarding her phone like it was an extension of her body. Screen turned down. Notifications silenced. If I walked into the room, she'd lock it without thinking. I told myself everyone deserves privacy. She became harder to reach. Texts took longer to get replies. Calls went to voicemail more often. When I asked about her day, the answers got shorter, more vague. Not angry, just empty. I convinced myself she was tired, stressed, busy. Physically, she was still there, but something was off. Less eye contact, less spontaneous touch. Kisses that felt routine, like checking a box. When I reached for her, she didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. That difference mattered, and I ignored it. She also started talking differently about independence. About not losing yourself in marriage. About how people change and shouldn't feel trapped. At the time, I thought it was just self-growth talk. I nodded along, never realizing she was already justifying a life that didn't include loyalty or me. There were moments that should have stopped me cold, but instead I worked overtime to explain them away. She started going out more, always with friends from work. Always with details that never quite lined up. Names changed. Stories shifted. If I noticed, she'd smile and say I was overthinking it. She became defensive over nothing. A simple question turned into me interrogating her. If I pointed out inconsistencies, she flipped it back on me, said I didn't trust her, said my insecurity was the real problem. And I believed her. I told myself that trust meant not asking too many questions. Her schedule stopped making sense. Late nights that had no clear reason. Weekend plans that appeared last minute. When I expressed discomfort, she framed it as control. As if expecting transparency in a marriage was some kind of moral failure on my part. The biggest red flag was how often I felt the need to justify her behavior to myself. Every time my gut reacted, my brain rushed in to silence it. Love, I thought, meant giving the benefit of the doubt. I didn't realize I was slowly training myself to ignore the truth. The first real moment something felt wrong wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming, no discovery, no obvious betrayal. It was a quiet sentence that landed heavier than it should have. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, both on our phones. I made a comment about a couple we knew who had split because of cheating. Without looking up, she said, "People put too much weight on monogamy anyway." I laughed it off at first, waiting for the punchline. It never came. I looked at her, expecting clarification, but she just kept scrolling. When I asked what she meant, she shrugged and said, "I mean, it's not the worst thing someone can do." Something tightened in my chest. Not anger, confusion. That wasn't how we talked before. Loyalty had always been a given, not a debate topic. I told myself she was just being philosophical, playing devil's advocate. Anything but what it actually was. That night, lying next to her, I felt more alone than I ever had in our marriage. She was inches away, yet emotionally unreachable. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself nothing had changed, while every instinct I had was telling me it already had. It wasn't just her behavior that changed, it was the way she spoke. The words she used became carefully chosen, almost clinical. Where there used to be we, there was now I. Where there used to be feelings, there were concepts. She stopped saying things like, "I'd never hurt you." Instead, she talked about personal truth and living authentically. If I brought up commitment, she reframed it as expectation. If I mentioned promises, she called them assumptions. Every sentence seemed designed to remove responsibility without sounding cruel. When I tried to explain how certain things made me feel, she didn't respond emotionally. She analyzed me, told me I was projecting, said I was attaching meaning where there was none. She never raised her voice, she didn't need to. Her calmness made me feel irrational for even caring. Over time, I started doubting my own reactions. Her language made betrayal sound reasonable and loyalty sound outdated. And without realizing it, I was being slowly talked out of my right to be heard, long before I even knew the truth. The emotional distance didn't start after the affair. It started long before, in ways that were easy to excuse and hard to confront. She stopped sharing things with me, not just problems, but thoughts. I'd ask what was on her mind, and she'd say, "Nothing," in a way that ended the conversation. We were in the same space, but living in different worlds. She laughed more at her phone than with me. Conversations felt one-sided, like I was reaching across a gap that kept widening. When I tried to get closer, she accused me of being needy. When I pulled back, she didn't notice. Intimacy became mechanical. There was no curiosity, no warmth, no after. Just routine. I told myself this was normal, that passion fades, that emotional closeness ebbs and flows. What I didn't want to admit was that intimacy without connection feels empty, and I felt that emptiness every time. Looking back, the affair didn't create the distance. The distance made space for the affair. By the time another man entered her life, she had already emotionally left mine. The lies weren't dramatic, which made them harder to challenge. They were small, almost boring, and they stacked up slowly. She'd tell me she was working late, then mention a casual detail that didn't fit, a place she couldn't have been, a time that didn't line up. When I asked, she corrected herself without missing a beat. Her stories changed depending on when I asked. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to make me feel uneasy. If I pointed it out, she'd sigh and say I was nitpicking, that I was keeping score, that I needed to relax. Somehow, her inconsistencies became my flaw. She started preemptively explaining things I hadn't questioned yet. Long justifications for simple plans. Too much context, too fast. I remember thinking it sounded rehearsed, then immediately feeling guilty for thinking that at all. What confused me most was how convincing she was. Not emotional, not desperate, just smooth. The lies didn't fall apart because she believed them herself, and because I wanted to believe her more than I wanted the truth. I didn't discover the cheating in some explosive, movie-style moment. No lipstick on a collar. No hotel receipt. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. I was sitting alone, scrolling through her tablet, not even looking for anything specific. A message preview popped up, a name I didn't recognize. The tone was familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. Too intimate. Too comfortable. Not something you send a friend. I opened the thread. I shouldn't have, but I did. There it was, weeks of conversations. Flirting that slowly turned explicit. Inside jokes I'd never heard. Plans disguised as coincidences. No single message said, "We're having an affair," but together they screamed it. What hit me hardest wasn't the sexual content. It was how alive she sounded. Curious. Engaged. Present. A version of her I hadn't seen in a long time, and hadn't realized I'd lost. I remember sitting there, numb, scrolling back further than I should have. Each message confirmed the same thing. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Repeated, deliberate, and hidden from me without a second thought. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to breathe, to make sure I wasn't imagining it, to steady myself before everything changed. When I finally did, it was late at night. The house was quiet. No distractions. No escape. I told her I knew. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just said his name and watched her face for a reaction. There wasn't one. No shock. No panic. Just a slow exhale, like someone finally putting down a heavy bag. She didn't deny it. Didn't ask how I found out. She looked at me and said, "Okay," as if I'd just stated an inconvenience. That calmness rattled me more than yelling ever could have. I asked why. Not angrily, desperately. I was still clinging to the idea that there was an explanation that would make it hurt less. She tilted her head and said, "I didn't plan it. It just happened." When I asked if she felt bad, there was a pause. Not a conflicted one. A measured one. Then she said, "I don't feel the way you want me to feel." That's when I realized this conversation wasn't going to save anything. It wasn't about truth or repair. It was about her being done and me just catching up. That's when she said it out loud. The sentence that erased whatever hope I had left. "I don't owe you loyalty." She said it calmly, like it was a boundary she was proud of. Not defensive, not angry, just certain. I stared at her, waiting for something to follow. An explanation. A crack in her voice. Anything that suggested she understood what those words meant. Nothing came. She told me guilt was a social construct. That loyalty was something people used to control each other. That I was confusing marriage with ownership. Every sentence stripped another layer of humanity from the woman I thought I knew. She spoke like someone who had already justified everything long before I walked into the room. When I asked if she regretted hurting me, she shook her head. "I don't regret being honest with myself," she said. "I felt nothing. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make you comfortable." There was no apology to reject, because none was offered. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't even asking to be understood. She had already placed herself above the damage she caused, and in doing so, made it clear, loyalty meant nothing to her, and neither did my pain. After that, my body gave up before my mind did. It was like something inside me finally accepted what I'd been refusing to see. I couldn't argue anymore. I couldn't reason. I just sat there, staring at the floor, feeling everything crash at once. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get a full breath. Not panic, emptiness. The kind that drains the strength out of your arms and legs. I remember thinking I should say something, defend myself, demand answers. Instead, nothing came out. Words felt useless in a room where empathy didn't exist. She watched me shut down with the same detachment she'd shown all night. No movement toward me. No instinct to comfort. That absence hurt more than the affair itself. It confirmed what I was finally understanding. I was emotionally alone in my own marriage. I'd spent months questioning myself, minimizing my instincts, trying to be patient and understanding. And in one conversation, all of that collapsed. Not because she cheated, but because she felt nothing about it. That was the moment I broke. The shift didn't come with anger or a dramatic declaration. It came quietly, in the middle of my silence. I realized I was still waiting, for remorse, for regret, for some sign that she cared enough to reach back. And it hit me. I was chasing something that didn't exist anymore. I looked at her and understood that nothing I said would make her feel what she had already decided not to feel. You can't argue someone into empathy. You can't beg someone into loyalty. And you can't save a relationship by yourself. For the first time, I stopped explaining my pain. I stopped asking why. I stopped trying to make her see me. The energy I'd been pouring into holding us together had been one-sided for a long time, and I was exhausted. I stood up, not to leave the house, but to leave the chase. In that moment, I chose dignity over denial. I didn't forgive her. I didn't explode. I simply stopped reaching for someone who had already let go, and that was the beginning of my clarity. After that night, the distance became physical as well as emotional. We moved around each other like strangers sharing the same space. Conversations were short and transactional. No tension, no fighting, just absence. The kind that settles in when there's nothing left to negotiate. I stopped checking her phone. Stopped wondering where she was. Not because I trusted her again, but because I no longer needed to know. Detachment replaced anxiety. What once consumed my thoughts started to feel irrelevant, like a story that no longer belonged to me. She noticed the change, but not in the way I expected. There was no fear of losing me, only confusion. When I stopped reacting, stopped asking, stopped caring, it disrupted the dynamic she was comfortable with. Indifference, it turns out, is more unsettling than anger. Distance gave me space to see things clearly, without emotion clouding every moment. The truth was simple. A marriage without loyalty, empathy, or guilt isn't a marriage. It's just two people coexisting. And I had already emotionally checked out of that arrangement. Walking away didn't happen all at once. It happened the moment I accepted who she was instead of who I hoped she'd become. When someone cheats and feels no guilt, that's not confusion, that's clarity. They're telling you exactly how much you matter to them. I spent too long believing explanations mattered. They don't. Remorse does. Loyalty does. Empathy does. Without those, love is just a word people use when it's convenient. A marriage without them is already over, even if no one has officially left yet. If someone looks you in the eye and says they don't owe you loyalty, believe them the first time. Don't argue. Don't negotiate your worth. Don't wait for them to suddenly care. Love without empathy is emotional abandonment. Cheating hurts. But cheating without guilt, rejecting loyalty altogether, is the final betrayal.